Hello and bonjour, I'm Sarah Bukhari and you're watching Power Dilemma here at TAGTV. Citizenship and immigration has entered to be the most critical issue on a global political spectrum. A huge influx of refugees into Canada in the immediate aftermath of Syrian war, refugees coming from Mexico through the US and other countries into Canada looms large on the policy horizon of decision makers in this country. What are the most pressing issues facing immigration, citizenship, and refugee Canada? What are illegal immigrants? Are they a burden on Canadian economy? What is the meaning of asylum seekers? Are a few questions we will try to answer in today's Power Dilemma with immigration lawyer Chantal Desloges. Her new book has just arrived. It's called Canadian Immigration and Refugee Law, a Practitioner's Handbook, 2nd edition. So welcome to my show, Chantal.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Okay, so Chantal, just give our viewers a little outlook on your new book. Like generally, what is it about?
Sure. So the first edition came out about a year and a half ago, and this is a new and improved edition. It's a book that is dedicated to a comprehensive analysis of all of the different types of immigration visas, and including refugee status. So it has a chapter on each and every type of visa, every different type of application. So there's a chapter about how to sponsor family members. There's a chapter about refugee claims. There's a chapter about express entry permanent residence. There's a chapter about visitor visas, etc., and on all of the different types of case categories. And what is different about this book is that it is comprehensive enough that it can be used by lawyers and consultants and professionals in the field, but it is written in simple enough language that anyone can understand it. Therefore, our target market really is anybody who's interested in learning more about immigration law or refugee law.
Okay. Chantal, I'm going to ask you to start with the discussion. I'm going to ask you a very important, crucial, or maybe a sensitive question. Are you happy with the current Canadian immigration system?
Yeah, if you look at the actual legislation, the way the Immigration Refugee Protection Act and its regulations are set up, the system is very good. It's very sound. It's been in place since 2002, and successive governments since 2002 have been working on little improvements here and there to make it better and better. And of course, depending on the government of the day, people may disagree over, should we emphasize refugees more? Should we emphasize family more? Should we emphasize business cases more? People can disagree about those policy issues, but at the core of it, our immigration legislation is set up in a pretty logical and sound way. It allows different categories for people who are coming to Canada for economic reasons, a different category for people coming for family reasons, and then a different category again for people who are coming for compassionate or refugee type reasons. And it also has a whole section dedicated to enforcement, because you can't have any system that adjudicates anything without having an enforcement mechanism as well. So, what happens to people who make misrepresentations on their application? What happens to people who try to help them to do that? For example, crooked representatives or people in society who may take money without being properly licensed. So I think the foundational the basis of our immigration law is good. And again, like we can play around with how it's administered and what to emphasize at any given time, but the core is good.
Okay, so you just mentioned government of the day and policies, immigration refugee policies or Canadian immigration system. There's a lot of talk about that liberals are better for the Canadian immigration system, and then the conservative side say that they are better and they have done a lot of good things to get people into Canada, but then the NDP says that they are even better. So what, as far as you're concerned, what do you think? What have liberals done and what have conservatives done to better the Canadian immigration system?
Well, these two parties have a really different approach to immigration, but what they have in common is that they both advocate for a sustained fairly high level of immigration in the range of 350,000 plus newcomers per year. And both parties agree that immigration is a net benefit for our economy, and it's absolutely crucial to our future growth because Canada has a low birth rate. And in order to keep our economy going, we need to be increasing our population slightly every year. So this is the common ground between the two. Where they differ is in how to apportion the different types of immigrants that we get, which ones should be more highly favored in any given year. So the way that immigration works is that the government sets an annual target of how many newcomers per year they project bringing into Canada under all the categories. Then they have to start taking that global number and dividing it into categories. How many of them will be refugees? How many of them will be family members? And how many of them will be business people or skilled professionals? And Conservatives historically have tended to favor skilled professionals and business people or people coming in to do work for Canadian companies. They've tended to prefer those types of immigrants and have smaller numbers of family class and refugee. Whereas the Liberal government is the opposite. They tend to favor higher numbers of family class cases, higher numbers of refugee cases, and a little bit less on the economic side. And I would say that I don't think that one approach is necessarily better than the other, because immigration is like a pie. And you can slice that pie however you want to, but you're still going to come out with the same global numbers at the end of the day, with some incremental differences between the two parties.
Okay, that was a very good explanation. You mentioned that both of the parties agree that Canadian birth rate is lower compared to other countries. So maybe you want to just elaborate on the philosophy of Canadian immigration system. What is the backdrop in which the current immigration system is based?
So for the last at least 30, 40 years, Canada has been in a demographic decline, meaning the birth rate is barely replacing the population, definitely no growth, and sometimes even going down. And what they know from economic theory is that in order to keep your economic engine going, you need a little bit of growth every year. And the key to immigration policy is to bring in the right kind of people who will help not only just the head count in Canada, how many people there are, but the people who will contribute the best to the economic and social fabric of the country. And at the same time, still allow people to bring their family members, because that's also important. We shouldn't downplay the importance of family. A lot of people come to Canada from all over the world, and it's hard for people to settle down and feel comfortable and put down roots in the country if you're always thinking about your mother who you've left back home, or you're always thinking about your younger brother or your children or your spouse that have been left behind. So that is equally important to building the economic fabric of Canada as the economic class is.
Okay, let's divert our attention to issues facing today's Canadian immigration system. What, in your opinion, are the major issues facing our Canadian immigration system? Chantal.
Well, I think that the answer would probably surprise you, because if you watch a lot of media, all you hear about is refugees. You hear about people crossing the border, people coming from the US, you hear about the war in Syria and Syrian refugees, and that seems to really capture the public interest. And that when people are running media stories, they want stories that are interesting. Nobody's that interested in talking about economic immigration or bringing teachers and doctors and engineers and skilled professionals to Canada. It's not as media sexy, I guess you would say. So you don't hear much about that. But what I think is really one of the core issues facing Canada today is the lack of a really cohesive business immigration program. A lot of the business immigration programs that we used to have were closed down by the federal government because they weren't really working very well. And in the successive years since that has happened, there really hasn't been any new program that's been brought in by the government to foster people who want to come into Canada and set up a business. It's actually pretty difficult to do that right now. There's no real set program, you know, for somebody, for example, might be in their 50s, who has a demonstrated core business background, might not be a multimillionaire, but, you know, could set up a good small business. There's no real program designed for that kind of person.
Isn't the business visa connected to this? The government has visa called business or investor visa, is it correct?
Well, so there is no federal investor program anymore, and there hasn't been for quite some years. What there is a Quebec investor immigration program. It's a very narrow program that only takes a couple of thousand applications per year, and it is only designed for people immigrating to the province of Quebec. It is not designed for people immigrating anywhere else. So those kinds of high net worth investors are not eligible to apply on the basis of their high net worth and business skills in other areas of Canada. And similarly, there used to be an entrepreneur program where it wasn't necessarily that you were extremely wealthy, but you had a demonstrated business background and you were willing to open a business in Canada. And that program, again, is no longer functional in all of the country except for the province of Quebec. So it's a problem.
Like, how about the new Brunswick investor visa or business visa?
Yeah, so every different province of Canada, almost every province of Canada, has its own what they call a provincial nominee program. And depending on the province, each program is completely different. So the idea is that the provinces should have a say in the type of immigrants that they are attracting to their geographic location, because the economic needs in a place like Alberta compared to the economic needs like in a place like Prince Edward Island are completely different. So a lot of these provinces have set up programs to try and attract small business people to their province. And again, each province is different depending on what they're trying to attract. So these would be people who you know, speak a moderate level of English, have a net worth usually of, you know, maybe a little less than $1 million, are willing to invest at least a few $100,000. But again, those programs are quite narrow because the provinces only have usually a couple of thousand spaces per year that they can use for provincial nomination. And they have to also look at international students. They also have to look at other categories. So it's a very small number of people.
Okay, you just mentioned students. There is a lot of controversy connected to Pakistani students and visitor visas into Canada. So let's elaborate on that issue, because our viewers would be very much interested into that, looking for answers for that very problem.
Right. So the problem goes back to the way that the law works when it comes to temporary visas. Whether it's a visitor or a student or a temporary foreign worker, the core legal test is the same for those three. And that is, if the officer gives you that visa, can they trust you to go to Canada, do what you need to do, and go home at the end of the visa without trying to stay in Canada illegally? So the problem then becomes for countries that have some volatility, or countries that may have some reasons for some people not to go back home after they come to Canada, it becomes difficult for those people to get visas. So if we take Pakistan just as an example, and I mean, there are many other countries that are in the same boat, because, you know, there is some sectarian violence, because for some people the living conditions are not good. Visa officers tend to be a little bit suspicious that if I give this person the visa, can I trust them to go home again after they're finished studying in Canada? And another issue is that the visa processing for Pakistan for temporary visas is now no longer done in Islamabad. It's done in Abu Dhabi. And the visa office in Abu Dhabi is a little bit more strict, and they also lack the special knowledge that the officers in Islamabad who actually live inside Pakistan and know the local condition, they don't have that kind of knowledge. So it does lead to some problems.
Okay, that's yeah, that can really answer a lot of questions connected to visitors and students coming from Pakistan. Moving forward, there was you know, lots of hue and cry and controversy and debates about that Canada is facing a huge refugee crisis. Do you agree with this statement or this situation, that Canada is facing a huge refugee crisis, Chantal?
Absolutely not. We are not facing a crisis by any definition of that word. We are talking about a few tens of thousands of people who have come across the border from the US seeking refugee status here in Canada. If you compare that to places like Turkey, like Lebanon, many places in the Middle East and in Africa that host literally millions of refugees per year, what we're experiencing here is really a drop in the bucket. If you look, for example, at Lebanon, Lebanon has a population of about 4 million, I believe, and they're hosting about 1 million refugees. So that means 25% of their population are refugees. Now, that is a major issue. So when you look at a country as wealthy and prosperous and geographically large as Canada, and we're talking about maybe 40 or 50,000 people who've come across and are being processed in the proper way, this is by no means a crisis. I mean, I certainly think that there are some logistical issues. There are infrastructure issues because, you know, unlike places like Turkey and Lebanon, Canada makes sure that people are properly housed. Canada makes sure that, you know, if they need social assistance, that they get it and that they're given work permits and they can work and that kind of thing. So, of course, it's all about balance. It's always about balance. But I think the only way that you could define this as a crisis is if you value resources and money more than you value human safety.
So you're saying they're not a burden on Canadian economy, the incoming recent influx of refugees?
In the long term, no. In the short term, I agree that yes, some people are. Because even though every effort is being made to give people work permits as quickly as possible, obviously, I mean, anybody who's moved to Canada from abroad knows that it takes some time to get a job. It takes some time even to get a minimum wage job. So people have to settle in. Some of them have kids and have restrictions on when they can work. So yeah, in the short term, it is a little bit difficult because you have people that you didn't plan for that are suddenly showing up, and then you have to scramble to try to find the resources. But over the long term, all of the studies have shown that immigration, including refugees, is a net benefit.
Chantal, are you happy with a third-party agreement with the U.S. Connected to the influx or free ingress of refugees into Canada?
My personal opinion is that that agreement should be canceled for a whole host of reasons, but mainly just for the benefit of viewers who may not understand how it works. This agreement that we have with the U.S. means that anybody who comes at a regulated port of entry via the U.S. and tries to make a refugee claim, unless they fit one of the narrow exceptions, will not be allowed to make that claim at a regulated port of entry. However, if they come into Canada via a non-regulated port, like for example, just cross in a farmer's field or in a zone where there is no immigration office, then they are allowed to make a claim. So the existence of the Safe Third Country Agreement with the U.S. is basically encouraging people to go around the normal ports of entry and to come in a sort of irregular fashion. Now, international law allows them to do that. And Canada is a signatory to those international laws, and our domestic laws also allow them to do that. So the issue that I have is that if that agreement is forcing people around the regulated ports, then cancel the agreement so that the people are incentivized to show up to a proper immigration officer, not to take risks of walking across a farmer's field in Manitoba in the middle of the winter to get frostbite on their fingers and toes, and have it done in a regulated manner. And the other issue is that I personally do not believe that the United States is a safe place for refugees anymore. I can understand, if I was an asylum seeker, I would much rather make my claim in Canada and trust our system compared to their system that they have right now.
Why is that so?
Well, if you just look at Donald Trump's policies, this whole thing with their crackdown, like their ban on certain countries, not even letting them into the country, taking people's kids away when they try to cross the border and claim asylum, which is their international law right to do. I just wouldn't trust that system. And historically, the U.S. adjudication system of refugees has always had a much lower acceptance rate than Canada. I think their acceptance rate is in the 20-something%, and ours is close to 50%.
Okay, so Canada still remains the favorite destiny for a lot of immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers. But why people are still frustrated to come into, they want to come into Canada, but it's the system still gives them a lot of hurdles. What is your, like, if you're appointed a Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, Chantal, what would you do?
I think there
to
are...
make it easy for people from particularly the third world country, the developing and underdeveloped nations to come to Canada?
I think there are three main frustrations that people have with the system. One is backlogs and delays, which is basically a function of more cases coming into the system than can possibly be processed in any given year. And that results in people waiting sometimes a long length of time, longer than they want to wait. And that is definitely a source of a lot of frustration. Now, this problem has really become a lot less in the past couple of years because of the express entry system for skilled workers and economic immigrants has made permanent resident immigration under economic category really a lot faster, and family class sponsorship is a lot faster too. The second issue is a lack of communication in general from IRCC, which is the Federal Department of Immigration. Any large bureaucracy will have these kinds of problems. They're the similar problems that people express when they try to contact Canada Revenue Agency. I can't get the information I need, I can't get someone on the phone, I can't find out what's happening with my file. So that I think is a technology issue, and increasingly the department is using technology to make that communication easier. For example, allowing people to file things online, communicating with people with email instead of mailing them a letter, which is so old-fashioned. And I think the third one is that a lot of people simply don't qualify. And everybody can disagree on the type of immigrants that we're trying to attract, but whoever is not on that list of the desirables that we want to attract to Canada, those people are always going to be disappointed. I think one thing that nobody really talks about, and I think it's a really important issue, is not only attracting immigrants to Canada, but retaining them inside Canada. In my practice, literally every day, I see examples of people who have immigrated to Canada with very high hopes, were not able to find employment, or were not able to settle down in the way that they wanted to, or they had family obligations that were pulling them back, and they've not been able to complete the amount of time that it takes them to either maintain their PR status or to take the next step towards citizenship. And I think the government really needs to focus on ways that we can retain these people. I mean, we go to a huge amount of effort and expense to attract these people here in the first place. And oftentimes what happens is that the wife and children will stay in Canada and the husband will go back to wherever, let's say Dubai, for example, is a popular destination, will keep working, many times not paying taxes in this country, and the wife and children will stay here and go to school on subsidized rates and get health care and all of those things. It's an important problem. Do
you think it's fair to Canada if people are using Canada and they get the citizenship and then they leave?
I don't have a problem with that. I mean, once a person has completed the requirements for Canadian citizenship, they are exactly the same in this country as I am, having been born here. We're treated exactly the same. So, if it's okay for me to go and live overseas and work overseas and stay out for 30 years and do whatever I want to do, then why shouldn't it be the same for someone else who maybe acquired their citizenship through naturalization? But I do think that the government seriously needs to pay attention to a retention issue. And a lot of it has to do with family. I think if the government would increase a little bit the scope of the types of relatives you can sponsor to Canada and allow them to maybe immigrate as a family unit, you would have a lot less of this back and forth.
No, that's a good idea. Moving forward and connected to the idea of that a lot of families come here, get their citizenship and go back. Do you think something has to do with the lack of assimilation programs or enough assimilation programs?
Yeah, I don't think it's as much assimilation programs. I think it's the way that the economy works. Canadian employers are, for whatever reason, extremely conservative when it comes to recognizing people's foreign credentials and experience. Having traveled in the Middle East and UAE, countries that bring in foreign workers all the time and give them very important positions in companies, I can't understand that sort of mentality in Canada that these employers have. I think there needs to be a lot more education about the benefits of people's education from overseas. There are many different universities all over the world that are not in North America where the degrees are as good, if not better, than the degree that you can get in Canada. So employers need to smarten up and start to realize that.
Okay, let's move forward to the Immigration and Refugee Board, which is a kind of association, and they have members, and they determine the status of refugees. Are you happy with the current working or the functioning of IRB?
The basic mechanics of the board are good, but I think that every system has room for improvement, and the Refugee Board in particular really needs to modernize the way that they do business. There are a number of things that I think they should do differently. Like, for example, there are some people that file refugee claims that they are so obviously legitimate refugees that I see absolutely no reason why they even need to go to a hearing in front of a board member. For example, if I am a Syrian citizen and I can show my ID to prove it, and I am a Christian minority and I have my baptism and marriage certificate to be able to prove that that's the case, I am a Christian from Syria, I am a refugee. Like 99.9%. So what is the point in wasting hearing room time, giving hearings to people who don't really need them? I think that the board needs to be a bit more intentional about screening the cases so that they can make the most effective use of their courtroom time. The other thing is their technology is absolutely abysmal. They still mostly communicate with people by regular mail. So, I mean, it really would be unusual to ever get an email from the board. They resist that. And it just adds layers and layers of extra steps and wasted time, totally unnecessarily. You can't, well, actually, there is a way that you can file some documents electronically. But for the most part, especially if the package is large or if there are more people involved in the case, you have to make a paper copy of everything and deliver it to each of the parties involved in the case. And it's just a huge waste of time, and it's like living 50 years ago.
So layers of bureaucracy and old methods of communication could be called, a hurdle in a very efficient immigration system?
Definitely, definitely.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, and once we come back, we're going to talk about and answer a few more questions. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Power Dilemma. We are talking to immigration lawyer Chantal Desloges, and we are trying to answer a lot of questions connected to immigration, refugees, asylum seekers. So continuing our talk and moving forward, Chantal, what is the meaning of illegal immigrants, and is there a difference between illegal immigrants and illegal border crossers?
Yes, so the term illegal immigrant refers to somebody who is in Canada without any kind of status and who is not currently pending for a refugee case. So this would be usually people who had failed their refugee claim and did not leave Canada after they failed their claim, as they were supposed to do, or somebody who may have come on a visitor visa or a student permit and then finished their time and were supposed to leave but failed to do that. So that is something, a term that a lot of people would say is an illegal immigrant. But it does not include people who are refugee claimants, because they are going through the system. They're not considered to be here illegally. The language around the border crossing that's happening between Canada and the US is actually quite controversial as to whether we should say they're crossing the border illegally or irregularly. And for myself, I prefer the term irregular border crosser. And why? It's because according to international and domestic law, it is actually not illegal to cross an international border, even if you don't have a visa, if you are seeking asylum or what we call in Canada refugee status. So under the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, it specifically says that people should not be prosecuted for having crossed the border if they're going through with a refugee claim. And that is in conjunction with international law, which says the same thing. We can't punish people for crossing borders when they're trying to look for their own safety.
Okay, connected to this may be, what is the meaning of internal flight alternative? It is connected to, I believe, refugees coming to Canada.
Yes, so under international law and Canadian domestic law as well, internal flight alternative is a term that we use to for the concept that if someone is in danger in their own country, they should first try to seek another place inside their own country where they can be safe before they go running to another international country to seek protection abroad. So it comes up with a lot of different countries where there might be localized violence in a particular particular area of the country, but there may be another area of the country which is relatively calm. And so it would be reasonable to expect that person, for example, if I'm in danger in Toronto and I can go to Montreal, I should do that first before I go to UK and ask for protection from UK.
Okay, so the refugees coming to Canada from Syria, they have no internal flight alternative?
No. Syria is a country which the United Nations has recognized that the entire country is in complete turmoil. It's not reasonable to expect someone, if they were in danger in another city of Syria, to relocate to another area. And there's two parts to that argument. First of all, it's actually dangerous to move from place to place inside Syria because there's so much violence and volatility there right now that literally just moving down the road from one city to another is enough to expose you to even more danger. And even if you could, when you get to the place where you're going, I mean, all the cities are exposed to, you know, much the same risks. But it also depends a lot on the individual. Like, for example, if it was the president of Syria, then yes, of course, I would say he does have an internal flight alternative. He could live safely in Damascus because he has all the protection. He's the head of the government. But if you're talking about a religious minority, for example, there's no place in Syria that would be safe.
So let me connect the issue of refugees with security. Do you think that refugees coming into Canada are vetted properly?
They are vetted more than any other kind of immigrant. They are vetted in so many different ways. When their security checks are done, they're checked not only by the police, but also by the National Security Service. So their past addresses are checked, their family members are checked, a lot of different analysis is done. The only gap in that is that sometimes there are countries with whom we don't have much of a relationship, and we don't have a lot of information necessarily about what happens in that particular country. So despite doing their level best, sometimes our security experts cannot vet somebody 100%. But that you will never be able to have a system that works 100% of the time. You have to accept that there is a little bit of exposure to risk, and you have to balance that against the fact that a lot of people are really running away from very traumatic situations.
Before the break, we were talking about members of the IRB, that is Immigration Refugee Board. What is the criteria of the members at this board?
Well, the criteria to become a member has really changed a lot in the last few years. It used to be purely a government appointment. So if you would apply and the government of the day liked you or wanted you in that position, they could just appoint you and it really wouldn't matter what your background was. Now there's a much more merit-based system. So a lot of people, first of all, are surprised that you don't have to be a lawyer in order to be a board member. So even though you're applying Canadian law every day when you're making decisions, it's not a job requirement that you have to be a lawyer. However, you should be an educated person. You do have to pass a series of exams and interviews. And there is a vetting process that they go through. Those systems could always be made better. No system is perfect, but it is certainly a lot better than it used to be.
So Chantal, what is the message you'd like to give it to the viewers who want to come to Canada as immigrants and as legal immigrants?
Right, so I would say two things. Number one, make sure that you get proper advice from a professional before you consider applying to Canada. There are a lot of rules and regulations, and just reading the government website is not going to give you enough information, and is certainly not going to give you any personal information about how the law applies to your specific case. So find out first whether you're actually eligible before you spend a lot of money and get disappointed. The second thing is you should never ever try to do anything through the back door. If you hear something that sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Do not ever trust anyone who will try to, fudge the facts or lie for you, because anybody who lies for you will also lie to you. And if you get caught doing something like that, the consequences can be quite severe. You can be banned from the country for at least 5 years, or if you've already immigrated, you could get a deportation order, which would affect you, possibly for the rest of your life, depending on the circumstances. So it is not worth the risk. You need to do things properly.
Okay, Chantal, it was very good to talk to you today at Power Dilemma, and viewers, with this, we are going to sign off. Stay tuned. Ciao.